Hi there, this is Power and Politics. I'm JP Tasker in Ottawa. Premiers are headed to Huntsville, Ontario next week, where they'll have a chance to meet with Prime Minister Mark Carney as the clock is ticking for a Canada-U.S. trade deal by the August 1st deadline.
New Brunswick is very keen to see an elimination of this uncertainty. We want clarity on softwood lumber. We want clarity on seafood. We want no tariffs.
We'll hear from New Brunswick Premier Susan Holt just ahead. But U.S. President Donald Trump's relationship with Canada isn't the only one under the microscope today. The Wall Street Journal published a bombshell story last night detailing a 2003 birthday letter from Trump to Jeffrey Epstein. The letter, according to the Journal, included a drawing of a naked woman. Trump says the letter is a fake and is now suing the paper and its owner. Our reporter in Washington will bring you the latest on that story. Plus, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is making some strategic changes as he faces a must-win by-election. Our party insiders are here to talk about whether it's enough for Poilievre to survive a leadership review. Power and Politics starts right now. Canada's premiers are headed to the heart of Ontario cottage country looking for an update on the high-stakes trade talks from Prime Minister Mark Carney. The First Minister's meeting comes as Carney appears to have shifted his tone, suggesting for the first time this week that a tariff-free deal with the U.S. may not be possible, and raising the question of whether Canada should be willing to accept some tariffs as part of a deal.
I think it is the reality of what things look like moving forward, but it isn't new. We've lived in a tariff-filled environment from between provinces, between nations around the world, and even at times with the U.S.
Susan Holt is the Premier of New Brunswick. Thanks for coming on. Nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you too, JP.
What are you expecting to hear from the Prime Minister when you meet with him early next week?
Oh, well, we're looking forward to hearing an update on the negotiations with the U.S. And how those trade talks are going, because New Brunswick is very keen to see an elimination of this uncertainty. We want clarity on softwood lumber. We want clarity on seafood. We want no tariffs. And so we're very much looking forward to hearing about the progress that Prime Minister Carney has made in those discussions. And then we're keen to talk about New Brunswick's role in building this country and strengthening our economy. So we have lots to talk about the Eastern Energy Partnership, about the critical role our ports play in building the economy of our neighboring provinces and our country, and the minerals that we have that strengthen our geopolitical position with other countries on defense and on the green economy. So lots and lots to talk about.
You mentioned the elimination of uncertainty. What about the elimination of tariffs? The Prime Minister and the Finance Minister are both suggesting this week it will be tough to cut a deal with the Americans without any tariffs. Do you think Canada will have to swallow some tariffs to reach an agreement with Trump?
Well, look, the Minister and the Prime Minister know best because they're in those talks. Our goal is always the most open, free, and fair trade possible, the least amount of tariffs. The goal is no tariffs. But there have been some form of tariffs in between our two countries at different levels on different products over a lot of years. It's just that the volatility, the uncertainty, the level of some of the tariffs, we'd like as much of that gone as possible. And so I'm prepared to put my faith in our negotiators with Ambassador Hillman and Minister LeBlanc and Prime Minister Carney that they will get us the best possible deal and as close to no tariffs as possible.
The Prime Minister seemed to be preparing the country for the possibility of tariffs sticking around this week. He was saying Canada already enjoys, essentially tariff-free access to the United States, but there are those pesky sectoral tariffs, of course, the Section 232 tariffs, as they're called. Would you consider it a failed negotiation for Canada if we can't get those tariffs listed?
Well, that's a good question. I haven't really thought about what I would consider a failure of the negotiations and a success. Certainly here in New Brunswick, we want to make sure our seafood sector is walking away tariff-free, and some of that then extends to the tariffs we're facing with China. We want to see those softwood lumber tariffs dealt with once and for all, and so that one's top on our radar. The aluminum and steel tariffs that are in place are a problem for us, and so we want to see some progress there. And ideally, we want a clear path to a new trade deal between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico that we can all be confident will be honored in the years ahead.
The reason why tariffs are so important for you folks in New Brunswick is 96% of the exports in St. John are destined for the U.S. I'm sure you've heard this stat. You know, St. John is what some consider the most tariff vulnerable city in the country. If we can't get those tariffs lifted, what would it mean for your province? What would it mean for the economy? What would it mean for the huge port there that sends so much to places all around the world? Take me inside. What would it mean for the economy if we can't get those tariffs off?
Yeah, this is certainly top of mind for the business community in St. John and a lot of the province, because while those are the headquarters of some of these industries, their operations span many communities and a lot of New Brunswickers. The good news is their products are in high demand. We're talking about petroleum products, we're talking about lumber, we're talking about the best seafood in the world, for which the demand has been increasing from Asia, from Europe, and other places. Certainly for energy products, there's an insatiable demand for those products from the U.S. and others. And so I think the Americans might find themselves paying more for energy products over time if these tariffs don't get addressed in the way that works for everyone. But we're working really hard with the business community, with the entrepreneurs of St. John around that diversification strategy, those new markets. And let me add, since I can, the port of St. John has been growing in capacity and volume, bringing New Brunswick goods to the world. There's new cold storage that's being built wharfside at some of the only wharfside cold storage anywhere on the Eastern Seaboard, and it brings our agricultural products to the world. So the growth in the port is actually one of the silver linings in this, is that they're coming on like gangbusters at a time when that's really going to help the rest of the economy that needs those connections that the port has to the rest of the world and to the rest of the country and into the U.S. They need that more than ever. So lucky for us, the port is really gaining in strength and volume right now.
The federal Conservatives are framing Carney's actions to this point as essentially caving to U.S. President Donald Trump, right? He dropped the digital services tax. He's holding back on retaliatory tariffs, at least matching the rates that Donald Trump has set to this point on steel and aluminum. And then his latest comments that we spoke about earlier this week, saying that it might be inevitable that we have tariffs after this negotiation. Pierre Poilievre was calling it a complete and utter capitulation. Do you see it that way?
Absolutely not. I think that there's a lot that goes into these negotiations, coming up with the best deal for our country, for our exporters, for our economy. There's a lot of different pieces that are at play here, particularly with other countries. I mentioned the Chinese tariffs that are in place right now, that some of which were earned because of relationships and agreements built with the U.S. There's a lot of moving pieces happening with Europe and Mexico right now. And I think, I think that we have the right people in the right roles with Ambassador Hillman and Minister LeBlanc and Prime Minister Carney, and I think they are best positioned to look after Canada's best interests and get the deal that does the least harm and creates the most opportunity. And I'm going to continue to advocate for New Brunswick's interests in lumber and seafood and others. And I know that we've got a willing partner and people who are listening at the top.
You're not alone among the premiers in thinking that we have the right people on the job right now. The Prime Minister seems to have very good rapport with the premiers, even conservative-minded ones like Doug Ford, Scott Moe, Danielle Smith. They seem to have a much friendlier relationship with Carney, especially compared to his predecessor, Justin Trudeau. Why are relations so good?
Well, I think it's because Prime Minister Carney has come in open. He's listened really carefully to what the premiers have told him about what's happening on the ground in our communities and in our economies. He's been really active in sharing information, getting the group together, asking for input, keeping us up to date on what's been going on. He's demonstrated flexibility. And he's demonstrated significant insight and experience in this space. And so I think that we feel like we have a partner in Prime Minister Carney who is going to listen and who's going to respect the role that Canada's premiers play in this country and in their own provinces. And we're building a path forward together.
Susan Holt, Premier of New Brunswick, thanks for making time for us.
Yeah, it was my pleasure, JP. Good to see you.
Nice to see you. Be sure to tune in Monday for special coverage of the Premier's summer meeting. Power and Politics host David Cochrane will be live from Huntsville, Ontario. Live coverage starts at 5 p.m. Eastern on CBC News Network and live streaming on the CBC News YouTube page. Still to come, we'll hear from the Canadian auto industry on what they want to see out of next week's Premier's meeting. And we're only 1 month away from the by-election in Battle River Crowfoot. It's Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre's chance to get back into Parliament. Our party insiders will join us for that conversation. Stay with us. Canada's premiers are meeting face-to-face with Prime Minister Mark Carney next week as a new deadline looms over Canada-U.S. trade talks. U.S. President Donald Trump has threatened new tariffs on Canadian goods starting August 1st. Prime Minister Carney suggested this week it's unlikely Canada will receive a deal without some tariffs. Brian Kingston is the president and CEO of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, and he joins me now in studio. Nice to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
So you're going to Muskoka next week to meet with the premiers as they kind of weigh these trade issues. What's your message to the country's leaders as they stare down that August 1st deadline to reach a deal with Trump?
Well, we need to do everything possible to protect the most impacted sectors right now in Canada, and obviously the automotive industry is in the crosshairs. So getting to an agreement with the Americans on August 1st, ideally eliminating all of these tariffs, getting rid of the Section 232 tariff should be the objective. That said, I mean, recent evidence from the American deals that have been struck suggests that that could be difficult. At the end of the day, we have to protect the automotive footprint in this country and all of the jobs it creates, and that has to be the number one priority when the premiers and the prime minister get together.
Okay, let's get into that in 1 second. You mentioned it's looking kind of hairy, the situation. As I mentioned in the introduction there, the prime minister now sort of suggesting tariffs might be inevitable because every other deal that Trump has cut so far to this point has included tariffs. Even with the United Kingdom, the U.S. has a trade surplus with the Brits, right? And he's still hitting them with a 10% baseline tariff. Can the auto sector live with Trump's tariffs over the long term if that's what we end up with?
Tariffs will ultimately raise the cost of manufacturing in Canada. And when you think about any new investment that comes into this country, we're competing with the United States, we're competing with Mexico. So permanent tariffs make it extremely challenging to continue to have a sector as large as we do. That said, I do remain optimistic that there is a mutually beneficial deal for a simple reason. We are in a slightly different position than a lot of other countries because the Americans send a lot of vehicles to Canada. We are their biggest export market by far. They have a trade surplus in automotive with Canada, and we have such a deeply integrated supply chain. So I think we can find an agreement. Could we live with some low level of tariff over a period of time? It's possible, but it's not ideal. And if that is the case, then we better make sure we are ultra competitive in this country to protect the industry.
We've already seen some disruptions, right, from the tariffs. I know that nothing has shut down permanently as of right now. But what would the implications be if we do have the tariffs? Are you expecting job loss? Are you expecting some of the assembly plants to close? Maybe walk me through what are the potential implications of that.
Yeah, so tariffs are taxes. So what it does is it will raise costs for manufacturing vehicles, not just in Canada, across North America. The current forecast we're looking at suggests that new vehicle sales could decrease across North America by almost 2 million vehicles over the next couple of years. So that translates into less vehicle sales means you need less production. Less production means less jobs in the industry. So that's where this takes us. But to be clear, this isn't just a Canadian issue. This will impact the American sector as well because these tariffs are raising costs on manufacturers in the United States.
What should the government be doing now to prepare for the possibility of long-term tariffs, especially those Section 232 tariffs you mentioned, which are particularly damaging to the sector? Steel, aluminum, autos, auto parts. That's not great, right? So what should Ottawa be thinking about now to prevent the worst case scenario?
There is one key policy change the government could make right now to help strengthen and protect this industry, and that is getting rid of the electric vehicle sales mandate. The industry is ringing the alarm right now about all of the challenges we're facing. Proceeding with an EV sales mandate is akin to throwing fuel on a fire. There is no way these targets can be met. This regulation has the potential to destroy the automotive industry. We're talking about, to comply with it next year, you may have to pull 1 million vehicles from the Canadian market to meet the ratio that the federal government has established under this mandate. It never made sense. In this current context, it is disastrous.
Yeah, I was looking at the mandate, and as it's currently written, it requires 20% of all new light-duty vehicles sold in Canada to be zero emission by next year. Sitting here in July, how close are we to that target? How close are we to 20%?
We are not remotely close. So right now we're on track this year to reach 9.7% sales. That's about 170,000 EVs sold in Canada. To get to 20%, we have to add an additional 183,000 EV sales into the mix. So that's an increase of about 103%. It is not going to happen. There's just no way to close that gap. And so what do automakers do? They've got two choices. You can buy credits from Tesla, which seems like a rather bizarre outcome given the current circumstances, or you start to restrict sales in Canada of your gas-powered vehicles so that you can balance the arbitrary equation that the government has put on the industry. So both are terrible outcomes. We can't get there. Look, automakers are selling more and more EVs. You see more in the market. They have invested heavily in this. You're going to see EV uptake increase, but you can't do it at an arbitrary ratio established by the federal government.
You met with the Prime Minister on this not too long ago. Was he receptive to the idea of getting rid of the mandate?
I think there is an appreciation that they've created quite a problem here. The math on this is irrefutable. There is no way the gap can be closed. And we've heard some suggestions, well, what if you just bring back the electric vehicle sales incentive, for example? You'd have to spend $900 million to close that gap. That is not a good use of taxpayer dollars, particularly when the target that's been established is frankly made up. So I think there's an understanding. What I'm not clear on is what the action will be. We think you have to repeal the mandate and do it now. We have existing emission standards. We will continue to deliver emissions reductions, but don't mandate the technology.
900 million, especially at a time when he's looking to cut, right? So that might be a problem. Automakers are canceling, delaying, they're scrapping EV projects. We saw Northvolt go bankrupt. We saw Honda put its plans on pause. I know in Oakville with Ford, they kind of dialed back their plans for EVs. They're going with pickup trucks instead, I think, right? There was some disruptions at GM's Cami plant in Ingersoll, Ontario. What is going on? Why are all of these much touted projects that the government, the last one, was all excited about, why is it stumbling? Why are there these issues that are emerging?
Well, when it comes down to it, automakers have to respond to the market. And right now we are seeing a slowdown in consumer demand. And there are a number of reasons for it. We haven't hit price parity yet with gas-powered vehicles. In part, the recent trade wars are definitely not helping as tariffs increase across the board. We're also having to go from the early adopters. So think about your early EV buyer. Usually it's a high-income household and maybe it's their second or third car. They didn't have to work too hard to be convinced to move to electric. Now when you go to mass adoption, you've got a household that's got one vehicle, they do a lot of driving, they're going to ask about price and they're going to ask about charging infrastructure. And currently we have a massive charging infrastructure gap that is not closing at the pace required. So there's a number of factors. Electrification is absolutely still the future, but is it going to happen as quickly as government planned? Definitely not.
One way to get to that planned target, some green activists are saying, some climate change folks, some environmental groups are saying, let the Chinese EVs in. They're cheaper, they might be more affordable, we're going to be able to get more people into an EV quicker if that's where we're at. The Chinese are more competitive on that front. What do you say to folks who are saying, lift the tariffs that are blocking those Chinese EVs from coming in, get more folks into EVs, then we'll meet that target, no problem. What's your response to them?
Well, look, the trade-off here is simple. You bring in cheap, highly subsidized EVs. The Chinese government has put about $230 billion in subsidization into their sector. The trade-off is that you lose your automotive industry and you completely erode your industrial base. Automotive is the backbone of our manufacturing sector in this country. We've seen this playbook from China before. They build massive domestic capacity, then they export subsidized product, flood global markets, and ultimately take out industries and make them dependent on China. That is hugely dangerous in this current environment. We simply can't let it happen. We will hit our emissions reductions targets with the regulations we have and the vehicles available today.
All right, let's leave it there. Brian Kingston, President and CEO of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. Nice to see you, sir. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks.
Political pressure is continuing to build on U.S. President Donald Trump over the so-called Jeffrey Epstein files. This after a bombshell report from the Wall Street Journal published details of a birthday letter it says was written by Trump to Epstein in 2003, something Trump declined to answer questions about today.
Mr. President, why not go further than just unsealing this?
Mr. President, did you send that letter? Release the full files?
The CBC's Chris Reyes is on this story for us tonight, and she joins us live from New York. Hey, Chris, what's the latest with the situation?
Hey, JP, it's not all. Yeah, what's the latest? Sorry to be talking over you, but I was going to say that it's not always that you see President Trump walking away from reporters like that, not answering any questions, and that's because it's so obvious that he has lost patience for this story. And I'll tell you, the latest right now just broke. President Trump has followed through on a threat that he made against the Wall Street Journal after, as you were talking about, an article was published last night claiming that that Trump wrote an explicit letter that he signed, sent to Jeffrey Epstein for Epstein's 50th birthday. And the claim is that it included a drawing of a naked woman. Now, we haven't seen this letter, and Trump has called the letter a fake thing. He then said this on Truth Social early this morning. I'm just going to read it to you verbatim. He said, "I look forward to getting Rupert Murdoch to testify in my lawsuit against him and his pile of garbage newspaper." That suit that he was threatening to file has now been filed in Miami federal court. It is against Dow Jones, News Corp, Rupert Murdoch, and 2 Wall Street Journal reporters. This is just the latest escalation in the Epstein story as it relates to President Trump, who promised during his campaign to release all the files in this case, which never went to trial because Epstein died in prison. The financier was facing multiple charges related to child sex trafficking and sex abuse. And earlier this month, U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi said that there was nothing to release in terms of a client list and nothing to investigate in the cause of death, which was by suicide. And since then, there has been this massive backlash, JP, against all of that. And surprisingly, it has come from Trump's MAGA base. Some of the loudest and most prominent commentators of that base have called for the resignation of Pam Bondi.
Yeah, tell us more about some of the reaction we're hearing from Trump's MAGA supporters.
Yeah, I mean, to understand that base, and you would know this as a political reporter, you had to listen to their loudest and most prominent commentators. That is an essential part of the MAGA universe, is all of the talk personalities that they listen to. And on this issue, with the Epstein case and the promise of releasing all of this information, they have been up in arms since Pam Bondi made that announcement. And they have targeted a lot of their anger towards the Attorney General. They've asked for her resignation. We're talking about the likes of Lara Loomer and Glenn Beck. They've called for her dismissal. They've called her dismissal of the case a betrayal. How does that actually translate to MAGA voters? Well, one Republican strategist says that he doesn't expect a divorce from Trump's most loyal supporters and the president.
I firmly believe the MAGA base will stay united behind President Trump. And I go back to this Wall Street Journal piece. This is the kind of stuff, frankly, that rallies the base, the MAGA base behind President Trump. This will actually energize them. And that's a big component here.
And that same strategist, by the way, JP, referring to a poll that shows that Trump hasn't lost any support from voters. Republicans, including Republican leadership, they seem to also be rallying behind President Trump. We heard from Speaker of the House Mike Johnson last night, seeming unfazed by all of this, saying that he trusts the process, he trusts the Attorney General, and trusts the American people to really make up their own mind when and if these documents are finally released.
All right, thank you so much. The CBC's Chris Reyes in New York. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is changing his strategy as he faces a must-win by-election in just 1 month. That's as the number of people running in his chosen riding of Battle River Crowfoot shoots up to 108 candidates so far, breaking the record for the longest ballot in a federal election. Most of those candidates are part of the longest ballot committee, a group protesting Canada's first past the post electoral system. Our panel of political insiders will dig into that next. Stay with us. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre dialed back his public appearances after losing the spring federal election. Sources close to him told me he was taking time to reassess his strategy, and now he's making some tweaks. Poilievre faces a must-win by-election in just 1 month, hoping to return to the House of Commons with a seat in the Alberta riding of Battle River Crowfoot. But for now, one thing that is not changing is his reliance on campaign advisor Jenny Byrne. Byrne has been a controversial figure among some Conservatives. She's advising Poilievre through the by-election and his upcoming leadership review. Let's bring in our panel of party insiders. Melanie Richer is a former communications director for the NDP. And here with me is Greg McEachran, a former Liberal ministerial advisor, and Fred Delory is a former Conservative campaign manager. Nice to see all you guys on this Friday. Thanks for coming in.
You.
Nice to see you, Mel, too. Greg, the Conservative leader is apparently making a conscious effort to shift his tone and his strategy. Have you been seeing any evidence of that to this point?
So Mel and Fred and I were chatting. We've got some questions for you, JP. It's a great article that you've done. I encourage everyone to take a look at it. But when you said apparently, I think apparently is doing a lot of work in that sentence. And I just did a kind of a check during the election of how many times we saw articles about that he was going to pivot or he was going to change tone, and then they resisted that. And I think this is gets to the heart of the challenge of trying to make changes. If you believe you've not done anything wrong, you don't want to change anything. And I think it's a sunk cost fallacy here, where it's hard for some people. It's hard for all of us to admit where we've done something wrong. But once you do, and you can mark that, you can then move on. You also learn from it. Look, in our corporate world, you know, when we've had mistakes in the past and the teams that I've worked on, we found it the easiest way to kind of move on is you let the client, you let the individual know that the mistake was made. You've acknowledged it, you apologize. You can explain why it happened in that ways that you're going to prevent it from happening again. And they're not in this space. Like, I find it very interesting. I mean, Aaron Wary wrote about this in April. I saw it in the Toronto Star. Is he changing? Is he not? But less than 2 weeks ago, he was at the Calgary Stampede, and he started to say, I want to be nonpartisan and welcome Mark Carney. And then he made fun of the way he flipped a pancake. And if you're trying to look at this guy in terms of how he would deal with Trump, he actually sounds like Trump. In the big picture of everything that's going on right now in the world and in Canada with our trade issues, you want to talk about pancake flipping? No one is taking you seriously. So not to take anything away from your article, I know you're reporting what you're hearing and being told, and Steph Levitz earlier this week in the Globe had, you know, there was a rumor going around that Jenny Byrne was done, and this is your job. You need to report this, but I'll believe it when I see it.
I mean, Fred, there has been some shifts, at least publicly, in terms of the public-facing attitude of Pierre Poilievre. He's not quite as combative, frankly, as he was, especially at press conferences. He spoke to CBC Radio last week. He was quite generous, frankly, with Carney, saying it's not all his fault that we don't have a trade agreement yet. The Americans have, you know, given us a raw deal, and he's just dealing with their unfair approach to our country and the economy and tariffs. And he was, you know, deferential in a way to the Prime Minister on that. In other spaces, he's been less deferential over the last week. Have you noticed any sort of shift? Do you think that we should read into how Poilievre is approaching the U.S. issue in particular? Is that a suggestion that there might be some changes from him?
There's going to have to be some changes, given that his entire message track that he's been on for the last 2 years is gone.
Yep.
His opponent, Justin Trudeau, is gone. Those issues are gone. He doesn't know right now what his track is. So there's obviously changes from that, but it doesn't mean it's a conscientious, we're going to try this different approach. I don't think they've figured that out. I don't think they know what they're doing right now. I said months ago, and I'll say it again, they should just be going dark right now and figuring that out. He's got the rest of the summer to do that. He is running in a by-election that he's going to win handily, and he can go back to the House of Commons in late September, early October, have a seat there, and hopefully have some kind of coherent message and plan that they spent these few months working on. We talk about post-mortem. I'm a big believer in doing that. I'm seeing no signs of this actually happening at the level it needs to happen so that we can understand what worked and what didn't. There are some successes we've had in this election. It's not all bad. We have to learn what that is. But we didn't win government. We lost for the 4th straight time. And we've got to figure out why that is and how we get better next time.
Mel, have you noticed any changes from Pierre Poilievre? I mean, he's known really as the ultimate attack dog politician. He hasn't been quite as firebrandy as of late, I would say, right? He does seem to be, at least in his public remarks, maybe not online. He definitely takes a different persona online. But in his public persona, it's quite a bit different, at least from my vantage point.
You know, what I've been finding is he seems dejected, right? Like, it's not necessarily that he has changed his tone or that he's changed his approach to how he talks about the issues that matter. He just kind of seems like not maybe unhappy or maybe sad's the way to talk about it. When I hear him talk, he sounds like somebody who's just lost, who is talking and who doesn't really know what to point to for that loss, and he doesn't really know what to say coming out of that loss. You know, when we heard him on the House over the weekend saying, I lost because I told the truth and because public servants didn't like me, it was kind of like, you're not listening, I think, anyways. If he doesn't want to listen and he doesn't want to change approach, you know, go nuts, Conservatives. Don't let me stop you. But it really sounds like somebody who is still unable to look inward to see what went wrong, what he did wrong, what his team did wrong. And it's just like, I'm still blaming, you know, everybody else. So that's what it sounds like to me, is it sounds like a little bit dejected, doesn't really know where he's going with it. I would say, I think the real test for him, of course, the by-election, which I take Fred's point that I don't think that there's any chance of him losing that. I think the margin of how much he wins that will matter to members as it relates to any potential leadership review. But the real thing, I think, for what it matters to, you know, Monsieur and Madame tout le monde, regular Canadians, is what is he saying in September? Is he saying kind of the same things Carney's saying? Does he have a point that's different than Carney's? You know, we saw something in the House in June that we haven't seen in years, which was the Conservative support, the passing of the Liberal bill. So what does that look like in September? Is there a way for him to differentiate himself? What is he saying? Is it connecting with what people are feeling? Or is it just more of this, I don't really know what you're saying, I don't really know what the message is, that we've been seeing over the last few weeks?
To your first point, Mel, about being sad, some people were describing it to me as deflated. It's been tough for him to swallow the election result, not only the general election result, but also the result in his riding, and having to go through a by-election process. Like, it has been traumatic, I guess, for him, as it would be for anybody, I guess, and he's probably just having a natural reaction. But Greg, one thing that's not changing, and I take your point that maybe there hasn't been any changes, but one thing that is definitely not changing is Jenny Byrne. He's keeping his senior advisor, at least for now. All the people around him, the folks around her, are telling me that they have a solid relationship, that things are going to continue with her in the catbird seat. What do you make of that decision to hold on to Jenny Byrne, someone who some people say was quite great? They got one of the best election results since the 1980s, the Conservative Party. Others are saying we fell flat after months, you know, in the top poll position on polls. Do you think it's wise for him to keep her?
Look, as a former staffer, to me, the ultimate form of loyalty is to fall on your own sword. And when you realize you are the person who's creating the problem, you're creating the noise, you are the symbol, then you get the hell out of the way. And it's really tough. I saw this in the Martin era, I saw this in the Trudeau era, and it's really tough for people to do this. And I think it really comes down to, being if you as a political staffer, if you're ultimately loyal, then you lean in for the greater good. And if that's you taking a step back, then you do so. I have no idea what that relationship is like, but I know for about 2 years I sat around this table while the polls were so bad for Justin Trudeau, and I heard from lots of Conservatives telling us what we should be doing. And yet the Conservatives had $50 million to spend before the election started. They were 20, 25 points ahead. And I think Canadians looked at that and said, you have everything going for you right now, and you're still going to be mean and nasty. One of the things that I was thinking about during the last conversation, perhaps Pierre's tone has changed, but he's not in the House of Commons, where he really bathed in that really meanness. There was an accusation he made about Prime Minister Trudeau that was just beyond the pale, and I noticed he didn't repeat it outside. JP, look, the thing that really stood out for me this year, it was the way that Jenny Byrne went after Aaron O'Toole. Aaron O'Toole should send Jenny Byrne a muffin basket of thanks, because he said something nice about Anita Anand on Twitter, and Jenny Byrne went after him so hard and ridiculously so. And I think a lot of people thought, well, this is the person who has his ear. She did it again when the Oilers lost the Stanley Cup, making fun of Oilers fans because there was members of the team that posed with Mark Carney. Michelle Rempel followed this as well. It just seems unnecessarily mean.
Fred?
There's a lot to respond there. I'm not sure what angle you want me to take, but to the core of your question about Jenny Byrne and Pierre Poilievre, there is no Pierre Poilievre without Jenny Byrne. There is no way, there is no scenario I see where she will not play a lead role in his next campaign. It's just not going to happen. People can talk about it. People who don't like her can say it. It's just not going to change.
Why is that?
They're so close. They've been working together for decades. They are a team. They've gotten as far as they've got together, and there's just not going to be a split there. I just do not see that ever happening. But some of the stuff we're seeing this week, you saw, the news stories, and we saw some Twitter spats. I think a big part of the problem here is that there is no real official postmortem taking place that can allow people to blow off steam if they have issues. All we're getting is, it's easy to criticize people in media. It's easy to go out and make these comments, but we don't know all of the good stuff that may have happened as well, because no one's actually sitting down and talking to all the staff and candidates and people across the country who volunteered and worked on the campaigns to get that type of assessment. It's a big project, and it's not happening right now, and it's to our detriment that it's not happening. Unless it's happening behind super closed doors, and I'm not hearing about it, because what I'm hearing about is the rumbling that this isn't happening.
Mel, quick final word to you on this topic.
Yeah, I think we've heard for a while now that, the way that she runs things is maybe not the most conducive when you're losing. Maybe it's different when you're winning. It's easier to have people on board and treat them a certain way when you're winning. It's way harder to do when you're losing, and that's what we heard kind of throughout the campaign. I would also say, though, that, Pierre Poilievre, I don't think is fooling any of us that he had a big hand in the election and in all the decisions that were being made during the election. So if anybody should be responsible for what happened during the election, Pierre Poilievre should be answering to a lot of that.
Okay, premiers are set to meet with Prime Minister Mark Carney next week as the August 1st deadline for a Canada-U.S. trade deal looms. Is a tariff-free deal off the table? Our Political Pulse panel will be back for that conversation after the break. Stay with us. A trade deal with the U.S. is likely to include at least some tariffs. That's what Prime Minister Mark Carney suggested earlier this week ahead of a meeting with his cabinet. Now Carney's set to meet next week with Canada's premiers in Ontario cottage country, where they'll be looking for an update on Canada-U.S. trade talks.
The minister and the prime minister know best because they're in those talks. Our goal is always the most open, free, and fair trade possible, the least amount of tariffs. The goal is no tariffs. But there have been some form of tariffs in between our two countries at different levels on different products over a lot of years.
The reality of dealing not just with Donald Trump, but dealing in any international trade agreement. Tariffs are part of every conversation. It's our goal, and I believe it's the Prime Minister's goal to have them at zero or pushed down as low as they can.
The Friday Pulse panel is back with me, Melanie Richer, Greg McEachran, and Fred Delory. Greg, I'll start with you on this one. Did you perceive a shift from the Prime Minister when he came out ahead of that cabinet meeting and said, Well, there's never been a U.S. trade deal under Trump that doesn't include tariffs. That might be what we're facing. Do you think that was a deliberate attempt to send a message to the people of what to expect?
I don't think I saw it as a shift. I've always, and then I said this, I think, last week, where the message to me has always been we have to prepare for the worst. And, the way this president behaves is as pretty much as bad as it can get. And we could have 3 more hours, JP, of current events in Washington right now. So I think it is smart communication in terms of reminding people, telegraphing, that this is the potential. PBS had a 7-minute on NewsHour last night, 7 minutes on Canada and tourism. And as a beer lover, and Ben Franklin said, beer is proof that God loves us. There was an owner of a brewery in Vermont, very close to the border, and he said sales are down, and one of the visits are down, sales are down, and he said, if you're a Canadian and you want to take our beer to buy and take home, 43% tariff on it. And he said, our beer is good, but it's not that good. So there's a lot of other things that are lining up. Canadians are about 25% of the U.S. tourism industry. Yeah. But if you look at car travel, it was down in June, month over month, 33%, and it's 6 months in a row. Yeah. So there are a lot of things that are about to hit Americans that are slow moving and they've not yet seen. So there's a lot of other factors at play besides the other current meltdown that's going on around President Trump.
But do you see that comment as laying the groundwork for a potential deal with tariffs? Is that how we should interpret those comments?
I think it's that, but it's also the reasoning and the narrative behind things like Bill C-5. It's about encouraging the premiers to work together. In your interview with Premier Holt earlier this hour, she said we have the right team. And the fact that the Prime Minister is meeting with the premiers again, one of the things that didn't happen a lot under Prime Minister Trudeau was a lot of First Ministers meetings. Yeah. And now we have a lot of them. And look, I think Canadians want to see their politicians working together. But the other thing is, it spreads the blame politically. Justin Trudeau owns so much more than he ought to have. And trade is a lot of things. We have really lousy interprovincial trade. Yeah. And I can't believe we're still talking about it and still actually working on it because I've heard it so many times before.
Fred, Pierre Poilievre, speaking of a tonal shift, I don't know if this is one example, but he called the Prime Minister's language around tariffs capitulation. Is that fair? Is that how we should interpret what Carney said earlier this week?
Again, I think it's really hard to be leader of the opposition at this stage, but not as hard as being prime minister to have to deal with the president like we have in the U.S. I think Carney is, I always assumed there was going to be some kind of tariff on something. There was no way to get a 100% tariff-free deal. It just
some people expected that,
right?
Rightly or wrongly, right? That was kind of the expectation. That would be a good deal, no tariffs.
We're dealing with a guy in the U.S. and the president who negotiates like maritime weather, where every 15 minutes things are going to change. Yeah. If you don't like how it is right now, just wait. We are in this weird situation. We talked about it last week. I think you mentioned it, Greg. Like, we have a year and a half to get to the midterms. And maybe that's how we just keep playing this weird game. Deadlines keep moving. How are things going to go? Because, look, we could strike an amazing deal. It could be a great deal. And then come September, October, President Trump announces a new tariff on something he just randomly comes up with. We're dealing with an unfair partner here who really is, I think, doing incredible damage to relationship, not just with Canada, but to other countries that his country has, and it's going to be a continued problem as long as he's the president of the United States, unless again maybe the Congress and the Senate will change things in a year and a half's time.
Mel, do you think it's a huge political problem for the Prime Minister if he comes back with a deal that includes tariffs?
I'm going to disagree maybe with, I'm going to disagree with Fred and Greg a little bit. I think they're spending too much time together. They sounded a lot similar there, but which is kind of funny if you look back in the last 6 months. But anyways, what I think is maybe a little bit different is I don't know that the Prime Minister has communicated until now that it may include that. And to your point, JP, I do think that there's a lot of people who assumed, a lot of regular folks who assumed that a deal with the U.S. meant that we would not have tariffs. And I think that's what a lot of people have been waiting for, have been waiting to see the easing of that and the easing of this, tumultuous relationship. I think a lot of folks have empathy for the Prime Minister. They understand that he's dealing with someone who's erratic and who's changing his mind as often as he does. But I don't know that the Prime Minister has set expectations in a way that will leave people feeling like, oh, this is a good deal if it does include tariffs. I think, it was elbows up at first, and then we saw the digital services tax. We saw a few other things. And if it does include tariffs, I think a lot of folks are going to be disappointed because they're going to say, what is it that we were hoping that we were going to get out of this deal? So I do think that I think it was smart of the Prime Minister to put that into the window this week. Folks may have kind of looked at it and said, what do you mean that this may include tariffs? But I think it was smart that he's starting to set expectations. But I do think that expectations were kind of already set beforehand. So it's going to take a while for folks to understand that this is hopefully a good deal for Canadians.
So I only have 2 minutes for three of you to say something on this one. So please make it brief. What are you expecting from the premiers next week? What are you expecting with Carney and them? What are you watching for, Greg? I'm
going to be a bit cynical, but I think the Alberta Premier will be the fly in the ointment yet again, and the rest of the premiers will come out looking pretty solid.
Fred?
Look, I just want to keep this ball moving down the field. Hopefully we have C5 now in place. Hopefully we can start getting some projects actually announced and people championing things and getting things built.
Are you expecting, though, cracks? Because it's been a love-in, right, with the premiers to this point. Smith, you mentioned she's kind of on board with Carney, really. Will there be cracks if he comes to them and says, there's going to be tariffs, live with it? Is that when we start to see things fall apart?
Look, absolutely could be. If it hits one province harder than others, that obviously then that certain premier has a right to be quite upset and has a case to be made. If that's where we think, if there's any insight on where these tariffs may be hitting.
Mel, you got a minute? What do you think?
Yeah, I'm hopeful that we don't see any cracks and, we see some good stuff coming out of the meeting next week. I do want to point out, though, that this is the end of Premier Ford's kind of term as the head. And he has been, Captain Canada for the last little bit. And I think a lot of folks were thinking he was doing good things. The reins get passed to the Alberta Premier. So that, to me, is what I'm looking for, is how do you continue this all-in approach, this united approach? Folks, whether they were Democrats, Liberals, Conservatives, have thought that Premier Ford's been doing a good job. So what does that look like? How does that change with the concluding of his term is one thing that I'm paying attention to.
Yeah, for sure. It's going to be an interesting shift with him not leading the charge, right? It'll be a different flavor to it. Okay, let's leave it there. Thank you so much, Melanie Richer, Greg McEachran, and Fred Delory. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for your smart thoughts, as always. I'm JP Tasker. Thank you so much for watching Power and Politics. There's more coming up on CBC News Network. Stay right there.